should go. I'm sorry. Thanks for the signal. So much happening, easy to be taken by surprise. Hello and welcome to this morning's penultimate Tortoise ThinkIn in partnership with the New York Times, with whom we're sharing this amazing space, and with Polestar, who make battery-powered cars and are also partnering us for this session in particular. I've really been looking forward to this one because I've always been a closet car nut, and I do feel that to an extent the arrival of batteries means I can come out of the closet. But more particularly in a subject that has a lot of arcane and important but detailed policy ingredients, I think of EVs as the charismatic megafauna prowling the savannah. These are the things that we can really, visualize, get a hold of, touch, climb into, feel our lives changing as a result of. They're also in the news today because today's Transportation Day at COP officially, and it is a day for which the hosts have prepared a declaration to phase out all petrol and diesel, all new petrol and diesel by 2040. I'm sure you'll correct me if I'm wrong. And there's also an earlier deadline in there of 2035. A lot of manufacturers and countries have signed, a lot haven't, including VW, represented here on our panel, and we'll do some introductions in a second, and Polestar for their own reasons. So we can get into that, but we also want to go further. We also want to get into the bigger questions, because I think most people here are on the same side of the debate, namely there's a consensus that we need to speed up adoption of EVs. So what are the obstacles? What are the solutions? Where are consumers still resistant? Are they confused? And I'm also interested, as a journalist, always a sucker for sound bites. What's the analogy? What is the transformation from history that is comparable to the one that we envisage now? Is it horse to car? I don't know. Maybe there's a more compelling one from even further back when the wheel was invented. Anyway, very briefly about a ThinkIn for those who haven't been to one before. Even though we're up here on a stage and we look like a panel, we like to think that this is not your average panel discussion. Why? Because we've got two audiences in the room here in Glasgow, also online, and my job really is to encourage you guys to pitch in. So we do have some lights, but I'll try and see if hands are raised. I'll also get some help from our tech host, and we'll lean forward periodically to look at the chat, and we'll try and bring people in who are speaking in the chat. Also, if you're following online, remember, you can raise your digital hand by touching an options button. I'm hesitating because I don't know how to see your digital hand on the iPad, but I'm sure there'll be a way, and if I don't see it, my colleagues will alert me to it. But let's get started, because an hour will fly by, and just please pitch in earlier rather than later, otherwise we'll come to the last 10 minutes and everyone will want to talk and we won't have time. Let me introduce first of all Fredrika Claren from Polestar. And let's start with the news. You're head of sustainability at Polestar. The company makes only battery EVs. The declaration, which was supposed to sort of lead the news today, establishes a deadline of 2040. Why hasn't Polestar signed?
Well, one obvious reason is what you just said, that we are a purely electric company.
So you're already there.
We're already there. We have a plug-in, I have to say, Polestar 1, but that was an exclusive car only sold for a certain amount of time. But from Polestar 2 and forward, it's completely electric. And but we really want to support this declaration, and we are very proud of our founder, Volvo, who have signed it, to have the most progressive phase-out strategy, I would say, and who are really committing to that also now with this declaration. But we are here to talk about the fact that the transition is going too slow, and we're kind of in this climate echo chamber where we see a lot of commitments from companies, and I think that the consumer can perceive that we're in an in a great phase where everyone is buying electric, but the fact is that from 80 million cars sold, only 2 to 3 million are electric vehicles. And that is not where we need to be in 2021. This is a climate solution that our industry has today, that is scalable, that is absolutely feasible, and that, depending on how you calculate, can halve the emissions already today compared to if you would have gone with a petrol car. And that's an amazing impact that we need to implement within this decade to secure that we in the industry stay on the 1.5 degree pathway.
I should, on the question of whether Polestar is a pure play, some people in this room and certainly on the streets would say the fact that you're founded by Volvo makes it less than pure.
Do you?
Well, I know. I'm just offering that as a critique, because
I think it was a really smart move from Volvo to found an EV company, and we're really, our mission and our assignment is to be front runners and to secure that we innovate and we now really use the full potential of this technology,
right?
And that we can be a guiding star for this transition that needs to happen, not only in terms of accelerating it, but also due to the fact that it's not perfect, it's not 100% clean,
right?
But it can be. It actually, it is. It takes us on a pathway to both climate neutral and circular mobility, electric vehicles. So we also want to now dig into the production related emissions and environmental impacts and human rights impacts to secure that we take this opportunity and build something better.
Okay, and in conversations that we've had previously, you've talked about the need for what you call, what I've written down as a mindset shift. Who needs to make that? Is that consumers, or is it really other manufacturers?
This is something that really disturbs me, the fact that I hear a lot of people saying that you should have a mindset shift, or consumers need to have that, or we policymakers need to. It's a lot about what others need to do, and the fact is that we all have to change the way we behave and think about things, so what we are trying a lot is really trying to get consumers on board. We believe that we cannot wait for them to ask of us to provide them with more sustainable solutions. It has to be the other way around. We have to provide them with sustainable solutions and tell them why this is of value and important. So that's why transparency is such a big deal for us. Consumer doesn't trust the car industry today for obvious reasons. And that is a hinder in this transition. Okay, thank you. I see Ralph kind of doing what I think of as the Bulgarian head shake like that. Ralph Fitzer, you are Vice President for Sustainability at VW. Right. Forgive me, is VW the biggest or the second biggest car manufacturer at the moment?
It depends. Well, right at the moment, it depends probably on the daily performance. So we're either number one or number two, probably today number two, but on par with Toyota. So to give you as a rule of thumb, 2019, it was roughly more than 10 million cars sold in the world across the globe. So within the pandemic, as all industry, a bit less. This year also a bit less according to the semiconductor crisis, but yeah, size matters, and our mission is also, I mean, the name Volkswagen says it's cars for the people. Our mission is really to also allow e-mobility, affordable e-mobility for all. So not just in a niche for some, but we are really driving the transformation in bringing e-cars on the mass market.
Okay, and it's well known that you've invested or announced plans to invest tens of billions of euros in retooling the more or less much of your plant to produce EVs, and as an out of the closet EV nut, I'm interested by technological aspects of that. You've had trust issues in the past. Mm-hmm. I think that's maybe what Frederica was referring to, but why have you not signed this declaration why is it difficult as a company to get behind the 2040 deadline?
The 2040 deadline wouldn't be so difficult. The declaration calls for 2035 deadline from the OEM perspective. And
so the 2040 bit is,
I think it's a general policy statement, but,
right, okay.
But what the car OEMs would have need to sign is aiming for 100% zero emission vehicles by 2035 in leading markets. And let me start with the point that we are fully committed for the EV transformation, and on our side, it's really the battery electric transformation. It's not fuel cells, because we believe that doesn't make sense from an energy standpoint and from the cost point of view, because hydrogen only works with green hydrogen, and then you end up in very high costs and high energy demands. So battery electric is the most efficient one, and we are full behind the transformation. However, we see that there will be, as a global player, and we have 40% market of our markets is in China, 20% in Europe, 40% in Europe, 20% US and rest of world. We will see different paces of transformation. And Giles, as you mentioned, the trust issue. I mean, obviously within the diesel scandal, Volkswagen Group ruined its reputation, and now we steadily build it up within a very ambitious EV transformation. And if we look at the different countries, we will have different paces of innovation. We will see South America sticking for a longer time to bioethanol, which is available in Brazil. We will see a fast transformation in Europe. So 2035 ICE phase out in Europe, I think, is not an issue, because also the Fit for 55 program calls for that. We see, hopefully following the US. However, China will be challenging, and we believe we can credibly sign something that there will be 100% EVs in China by 2035 if the boundary conditions from politics are not appropriate. And this is the thing, we don't sign, and this is a matter of credibility and trust, something which we believe one can credibly adhere to. And that's why we said we're fully behind the EV transformation, but 2035 for China is not realistic, and thus we decided in this case not to sign it.
Okay, so let me just be clear. Why do you, about the reasons you believe you cannot fully adhere to it? Is it because of supply bottlenecks for key inputs, or is it because you want to remain present in markets like South America, where they're going to go on buying ICEs?
I mean, we're a global player. We have significant markets, and South America is one of them, where Volkswagen Brazil, for example, is more or less considered a Brazilian company. We are there since the early 70s, if I'm not mistaken. So it's considered a Brazilian local company, and we will continue to sell cars there as well. China is the other thing. We are working hard on electrifying also the Chinese portfolio. But if you look at the 5 years plan from government, and Mike, we talked about also this declaration is to be signed by countries as well. There are currently not too many countries supporting it. So if the government of China would also be in line with that aspiration, this would help us a lot. And we're also working towards that transformation in China. But as now, it's not backed by also governmental policies. There's one more argument specifically on China, because we're taking a life cycle perspective on decarbonization. You have to take into account the full life cycle: manufacturing, supply chain, and use phase. And as of today, due to the Chinese grid mix, EVs.
Grid mix?
Grid mix, so electricity grid mix. So you have, let's say, an average carbon footprint of 800 gram CO2 per kilowatt hour in China. With that grid mix, an ICE, an efficient ICE, is over the life cycle as of today even better than a battery electric vehicle. So we're targeting, with the Chinese energy system, the break even for ICEs probably around 2025, 2026. And there will only be slight advantages by 2030. So what we have to do, and this is about cross-sector collaboration and also public-private partnerships, we have to drive the energy transition, because a battery electric vehicle powered by electricity that comes from coal doesn't make sense. And this is what we're heavily pushing for, the build-out plans for renewable energies.
One thing while I've still got you in my crosshairs, can I just drill down a bit on rare earths and critical chemicals, as the US administration calls it? Why is China so dominant there? And is it true, as I've heard, that you basically have to be in China, like have your plant in China, as Tesla does, to guarantee that you can carry on producing EVs these days?
Well, overall, I think this is something that matters for all car manufacturers globally, because we're sharing similar supply chains. And with a shift to battery electric vehicles, we're talking lithium, we're talking cobalt, manganese, nickel, and so forth. So new materials getting more significance in the value chain. In certain areas, and there was a couple of years ago, the discussion around rare earth and magnet materials, for example, for the wind industry, and to manufacture motors and have the magnets, which was dominated by China. I think in the raw materials business, there are cycles. So sometimes certain countries dominate something, and also we know, for example, cobalt in the DRC, there's, I think, 70% of natural resources. So there's hardly no way outside DRC with its human rights challenges to get significant amounts of these materials. So what we have to do, and this includes China in terms of environmental standards, this includes some other countries in terms of human rights standards, we have to jointly work on increasing the standards along the value chain. Right. Initiatives such as the Global Battery Alliance and so forth. And yes, in China, I think for lithium hydroxide, there is a, let's say, strong footprint in refining, and we will...
A strong footprint, let's face it, that's a euphemism for really, really dirty, right?
Well, it depends, because I was just talking to a lithium mining company the days before. And they say it's not that it's that dirty, because there's also on lithium hydroxide refining, there's new plants in China, and they're fulfilling environmental standards as well. So it's not that China equals dirty. No. I think this is no longer the case. No, yeah. But there might be some political reasons behind it in terms of resource strategy, also driven by the government, that leads to the fact that a significant amount of processing takes place in China.
Okay, thanks. I'd like to come back to that. By the way, I'm really bad at following what's in the chat at the same time as following this conversation. But Tom McCallum, I do note what you're saying in the chat, and we'll get to you, I promise. And before we get to Mike Hawes from the SMMT, I just want to come back to you on transparency, because, I mean, how open are you going to be, about the metal refining footprint? Because we've talked briefly about lithium, but as I understand it, copper is also key and dirty, and China may be improving its environmental standards, but they've been pretty slack, right?
All of the materials, the minerals, the metals going into a car come with either human rights violation risks or environmental pollution risks. We tend to often focus on cobalt because those risks are so high, and we absolutely need to be really careful there. But as you say, aluminium, the processing, we have direct emissions from the processing of aluminium production. So we actually have to look at all of the risk materials, and not only the ones being covered by the press. And we need to have strategies that build both on responsible sourcing, like the old school way of working with code of conducts towards suppliers. You have a contract, it's signed, but now also really tap into the more innovative approaches that we can take. Traceability, for example, we are utilizing blockchain on Polestar 2 to trace the cobalt from the mine or the recycling plant to the finished product, enabling us to really secure an efficient and immutable system, where the supply chain that we have decided with our battery suppliers is intact. And if any cobalt, for example, leaks in from an unverified source, we get a warning notice. So yeah, the robust old school methods together with new innovative approaches will hopefully help us build a more sustainable way of producing batteries in cars.
Okay, thank you very much. Let's take a step back. Mike Hawes, CEO of the Society of Motor Manufacturers and Traders. very public role in this country. Do you think, looking forward, that the sort of most important constraints on realizing the ambition of rapid uptake will be on the supply side? Tesla's had trouble producing as many cars as it says its customers want, or on the demand side, because, you know, us punters out here, we've got issues. Personally, I've got an affordability issue. What are the big obstacles?
Well, if you look at the short term, and you look at the very short term at the moment, it's supply side. As Ralph mentioned, the global shortage of semiconductors has hit the automotive industry particularly hard.
Right.
It's why you're seeing, in terms of production output, in terms of new car sales at the moment, declines of about 30-35% year on year. And last year was rubbish because of COVID. That will gradually be overcome, but it's probably going to flow through to 2022 and into 2023. So short-term supply chain supply issues are significant. Medium to long term, and that's what we're talking about here in terms of the rest of this decade and into next, it is about primarily demand. Now, the market is moving in this country in terms of vehicles that can be plugged in. Last year, about 1 in 10 new cars sold was plugged in. This year, despite all those challenges, it'll be about 1 in 7. So you're seeing the market moving, and you see it moving rapidly. But when you dig down into those figures, you'll see of those customers that are buying those types of vehicles, 2 out of 3 tends to be a company car buyer. And most of them, I don't know the exact percentage, but the overwhelming majority have their own driveway. Right. The challenge is, this is about providing affordable zero emission mobility for all. And so it is overcoming some of the inherent barriers that are there that consumers face. The industry will put the vehicles on the road for sale, and increasingly that's happening. But we talked earlier about mindset shifts, and there is an element of that, but it's one of the big barriers is still affordability, because we haven't yet got to that situation where the total cost of ownership, when you include the additional purchase price in the UK, totally outweighs the cost. For business buyers, it's getting very, very close, and that's why you are seeing the majority in that. But that's still one of the major hurdles.
Just on demand, 2 thoughts. Norway has kind of solved that with incentives. You just get massive cash rebates, and so it's cheaper to buy an EV. But to what extent does a government deadline forcing manufacturers to change the kind of products that they produce, to what extent does that just kind of manufacture demand, as it were?
As you've heard, the entire industry, last November, the UK government published its 10-point plan, which effectively said, 2035, everything will be zero emissions. And the industry broadly said, yeah, we can just about live with that. We can get there, because it will take, we think, to enable everyone to make that shift, something of that sort of magnitude, 13, 14 years. So we have that deadline. And more recently, the government has said they will look to introduce what they call a zero emission mandate, which would presume will be a proportion of sales increasing will have to be year on year sold. So there are regulatory mechanisms which can encourage, which the manufacturers will comply with and have to comply with. But talking to customers, we said about affordability. You look at incentives. Norway is the incentives are phenomenal. Right. In Germany, they're about 8,000 to 9,000 Europe. In France, about 6,000 here. They're 2,500, and that's a burning deck. They will. The only commitment is to the end of the financial year 2022, 2023. We don't expect any further incentives to be available in the UK beyond that date.
I want to come to Rachel Revis in a second online, but just on Norway's incentives, and I'm not being deliberately flippant here, are those the kind of incentives that you can only afford if you're a rich northern economy with a big oil industry?
It helps, but also remember, Norway always has been a high tax country. Right. And vehicles, purchase of vehicles is expensive because they get high tax. So it's, if you like, you get your tax discount. And it used to be the case where, and I'll use an example of my colleague to my left here, that after the discount, the price of a Tesla Model S was in effect the same as a Golf. Whereas here, the price differential to consumer between those two models is
And
massive.
as you were talking about price parity, so with the German 8,000 to 9,000 euros subsidy or grant by the governments, we are very close to price parity for an EV, also for private customers. So, and over time, obviously, these subsidies, these grants have to be reduced because it's not wise to spend taxpayers' money for these subsidies forever. But in line with the cost out of the batteries, I think we will, even with lower grants or support from the governmental side, have price parity on the total cost of ownership very soon. So that's the good news for the private customers. Where we need significant cooperation with government is, I think, in terms of setting up the charging infrastructure, because this is heavily powered by private sector investment, but this won't be sufficient to cover all areas. So there we need really to create more momentum on setting up that infrastructures. And offline, we had a couple of discussions yesterday evening also, where people were seeking for charging stations in Glasgow, and they were not really happy what they found. So I think really accelerating the rollout of charging infrastructure is one of the critical missions to keep on pace with the increasing number of sales of EVs. So that's really an important thing.
Let's get back to how we do that, because clearly you're right. But this is part of a bigger debate on mobility in the energy transition, and cars aren't the only answer. Rachel is a freelance journalist who's written for us about EVs with a different take. Rachel, dive in here and give us the bigger picture in your view, or maybe it's the local picture.
Hi, thank you for having me. Yes, the local picture probably reflects the national one. I was just out for a walk last night, and it's one of those things where it's like Pringles. Once you start eating them, you can't stop. And for me personally, once I now see cars and the dominance they have in our society, the dependency we have on them, and the way they exacerbate various inequalities, which I can talk about, economic, gender, etc., but also the physical space they take up. So just walking around my area of Edinburgh and Leith, everything we do is designed around cars. The attack on public spaces, communal spaces, green spaces is immense. There is no link between the planning departments of councils with the active travel groups that might want to minimize future residents and visitors' car dependency. And the physical space they take up, and the fact that when cars are parked, which is also a massive issue because cars are getting bigger and bigger and bigger because they're more profitable, they block cycle lanes, they block bus lanes, they block pavements, they hinder disability, hinder people with mobility and accessibility issues. And I agree that electric cars and cars in general have their place. I'm not a purist. I'm drinking from a Starbucks mug. You've probably noticed that today. But the issue is that the embodied carbon that goes into electric cars is huge. The opacity behind their supply chains is huge. The lobbying power of the car manufacturers, including those that sit on the panel today, is huge. And that is why regulations, for example, are more focused on the driver, the seatbelt, the speed. But the cars, the vehicles they are driving, have the opposite incentive. They encourage us to make the wrong choices. They encourage us to live the wrong lifestyles. Now, I'm not judging individual people. As I say, it all has a place. The other thing I'd like to say is about the pollution. I've already mentioned the embodied carbon, and we all know about the issues about cobalt and lithium. The fact that, charging points are going to take even further space away from pedestrians and cyclists. The fact that cars are getting bigger and will kill more people because they're more dangerous. But also the Air Quality Association found that half of the air pollution is actually caused by particulates coming off rubber tires. Now, as cars get heavier and batteries get heavier, tires will wear quicker and there will be more rubber in the air, worrying as well. So I think my general point, I'm sorry, I'm not here to make friends obviously today, but I think there's
that's not the idea.
in the chat probably resonate with my frustration, which is that our lives, our cities, our towns revolve around cars. And this was not the way that should have happened. People have been talking about these issues since the 1960s, and that was before they were worried about the emissions. They were worried about many other things. We're following where the money is, and car manufacturers will sell more SUVs, more pickup trucks, etc., because they are profitable. In fact, there's a fantastic organization I'd like to alert people to called Badvertising, because car advertising has a massive role to play here. And they talk about the fact that car manufacturers can sell each other credits if their fleet, 95% of their fleet, does not adhere to European emission standards. Those that do can sell credits. So some manufacturers are spending up to 500 million a year to get around this kind of loophole. That is the kind of thing we're up against. And in the meantime, people, frankly, are dying. 36,000 people are dying of air pollution in England alone prematurely every year. And that's because I think a quarter of our emissions are coming from vehicles, and over half of that is from taxis and cars. And the other thing I'd like to say is that it's becoming cheaper to own a car because we are leasing them, we're not buying them. So you can rent I think you can rent a Range Rover for a couple hundred a month or something. It's absolutely insane, and that can't go on. So thank you for listening.
Thank you. There's a lot there, and I want to give Frederica and Ralph, if you want a chance to come back on that, and also let's start with you. Can you tell us your name first?
Yes. So my name is Blow, and thanks for that that kind of fairly lengthy monologue. But what struck me at the start was try living in Houston or Dubai. I mean, Edinburgh is one of the most walkable cities on the planet. So is Glasgow. We've introduced electric bikes there. All I wanted to say was, hang on a wee minute here. I've lived in Houston, I've lived in Dubai. You can't go anywhere without a car. Even if you can walk, you can't go without a car because people would look at you as if you were strange. So the point is, living in Edinburgh, you're lucky. Leith, very lucky. Portobello, lovely. Glasgow, lovely. We can walk around our cities in Scotland. That's all I wanted to say as a kind of counterpoint.
Thank you. Frederica.
Yeah, there was a lot of, thank you, Gabby. Sorry?
Rachel.
Rachel, there's Gabby. Thank you, Rachel, for that. Just one quick comment. The carbon credit scheme is actually something that transfers money from polluting companies to less polluting companies. So we and Tesla kind of receive fund from companies that have a lot of fossil fuel cars that we can use to innovate this technology. So that it's a special regulation that is really powerful, I think. I mean, what she's basically saying is that we are sending very mixed messages at the same time as talking about becoming climate neutral, that we are innovating in the industry, that we're up for the change. We're not seeing that change on the streets. And I would just love for all of the automotive industry leaders now to stop talking about what is realistic and really grasp the opportunity they have, because they are so powerful, and send clear signals to both the supply chains, but also policymakers needing to build better infrastructures. And one clear signal would really be to set an end date to when they are stopping the sales of fossil fuel cars, and to have a really progressive agenda on that, because that would create demand for policy and supply chain solutions that we so need. We need to solve this decade. 2030 is too late. 2030 to 2040 is too late. We need to really see the acceleration happening now.
Let me quote back one of the things you just said. We need to stop talking about what is realistic. I think I know what you mean by that. But if you're sitting where Ralph is, in a giant, and I'm going to use the word legacy company because you still make a lot of petrol and diesel cars, you've got to be realistic. We had a dose of realism about, Houston.
But what is climate realism?
Okay.
I mean, to meet the 1.5 degree goal, what is the realistic pathway there? So you can talk about how we can be realistic to meet policy and to really to meet the capacity in the supply chain. But we're here to talk about climate action, and we have science and we have clear pathways towards 1.5 degrees. And that is the realistic thing that we need to talk about. That is the perspective that we need to have when we talk about
I like to add a few thoughts on Rachel's comment.
Yeah, please.
Because I think we have to differentiate. There's different debates sometimes mixed in one. And obviously, I mean, more space for bikes, for pedestrians in cities. This is a matter of urban planning, and it's probably not the issue that the car industry is lobbying so much. It's the cars are used basically because there's a demand from the users. So that's a very basic fact. And the better the boundary conditions are to get rid of a car in the city, the less people living in cities will use cars and efficient public transport instead and so forth. So I think from my perspective, that's not something the automotive industry is counter arguing. But there's some, I'd like to add some facts to that intervention by Rachel. One thing is in terms of embodied carbon. If we're talking individual mobility, the battery electric vehicle as of today with the European grid mix over its life cycle is roughly 25% more CO2 efficient. Yes, we have the upstream supply chain emissions from battery materials, but over the life cycle of a car, a battery electric vehicle as of today, European grid mix 1/4 more efficient than a comparable ICE. And you have shown that the chart in the intro as well. If we move to powering a battery electric vehicle with green electricity, then you have the remaining footprint. So that's 2/3 less than an ICE. So if we're talking individual mobility, it's a necessity to go battery electric based on green energy, period. On that air pollution side, yes, rubber from tire particles is also an issue. The more critical issue also on the health side is the very smaller particles, which come to a larger extent from the ICEs. So moving to battery electric vehicles will reduce the critical particulate matter amounts in air. So this is, again, not an argument against battery electric vehicles. It's probably an argument against vehicles and other particulate matter emissions at all. That's taken, but we have to also differentiate a bit in this debate. What's the role of urban planning? What's the role of car manufacturers? And I truly believe if you want to go individual mobility in the future, it has to be battery electric because this is the best available solution.
Can you just respond to Frederica's specific point on sort of vision and speed? Does VW not need, I know you've had a lot of big sort of corporate away days rethinking the future. Don't you need another one where you say, guys, we're still not moving fast enough. Otherwise, we're going to have a Kodak moment in the worst way.
I don't think we will have the Kodak moment. I mean, there's often, obviously, I mean, Tesla is the big pure play greenfield and advancing very fast. And this is well monitored in our strategy, and our sustainability department is also part of group strategy. So yes, it's an ongoing debate. Can't we be even faster? That's true. But if you take the sales numbers of EVs, they increased from the first 3 quarters last year to the first 3 quarters this year by 138%. We now have a market share of EVs in Europe of 26%, which is, I believe, way above the ICE market share. So we're really accelerating the transformation. However, in terms of being realistic, I mean, it is a huge transformation endeavor and task to ensure the value chain for our 2030 European passenger car demand on ICEs. We need 6 gigafactories to be built for batteries. We need to ensure all these supply chains with lithium, cobalt, and the materials. And this has to be converted into practice, this planning. So we're working terribly hard in making that happen. And whenever possible, yes, we are going to accelerate. And the good news is we are behind the tipping point for EV adoption. I mean, 2 years ago, it was still a very tiny little niche, but now it's becoming mainstream. And So that's the point which keeps me optimistic. Probably at some point in time, we don't need that governmental ban by 20XYZ, because it's going in itself, because e-mobility is more attractive, more cost efficient, and don't know how many EV users we have here in the room. If you have a car, if you once have used an EV, I don't want to miss it anymore. And last comment also on that Rachel intervention, yeah. We do have also a significant potential in terms of shared use and new mobility solutions, ride sharing, ride hailing services, which we are investing also in with WeShare, pure electric car sharing and so forth. So I think especially for cities, there are solutions. No one need to own a car by him herself
really interesting
in the future.
Sort of
Giles, can I respond briefly, please?
Point. Yes, sorry. I did promise this gentleman with the red scarf, and then is there someone else at the back? I need to put my glasses on. Yeah, we'll come to you. We'll try and get to as many people as possible. I also promised to get to Tim online. Go ahead. Tell us your name.
I'm Sam. I work with Calusa. It's a B2G technology company. This is actually the perfect time for my question because you've mentioned transport as a service. I am really interested in transport as a service, but I'm slightly worried that this mass rollout of private electric vehicles is going to be just basically instantly disrupted. We have already got autonomous vehicles in California, and it's almost only a legislative issue that we don't have fully autonomous fleets in California. And I can kind of see that maybe not this decade, but in a couple of decades coming, there's going to be this massive rollout. And because these cars are going to be so cheap to basically hire individual services, this is going to be a really attractive option to the public. And so private transport ownership is just going to drop through the floor. And I wondered what your thoughts are and whether you've kind of considered this as a pathway.
Let's hold that thought, hold your responses, and let's come to the gentleman who has the mic already.
Thanks, John. David Clayton from Kaya. Two comments. One is at the Kodak moment, as it was put, I mean, Tesla's market cap is 10 times Volkswagen's market cap. I think the Kodak moment is kind of past. So the first point. Second point is just on the technology point, if I may.
Yeah.
Look, there are two ways to solve the infrastructure problem. One is by building more chargers. The other one is by driving more range, right? So the iron phosphate decision from Tesla a couple of months ago, the changes in battery tech and what's going on in China. I just wondered, A, what you think of the technology, where we will be in 10 years' time, and B, what the politics are of sourcing batteries in China.
Okay, thanks so much. By the way, I should have said we have this loosely enforced no questions rule to encourage you to say what's on your mind rather than phrase it as a question, but that's a really good question. I do want to hear responses to it. I'm going to ask you to hold them one more second because I promised Tim that we'd come to him. If you want to say something, Tim, now's your chance. And this is one of those moments when I look back over the chat and I realized Tim saying, no, I just want to be on the chat. Oh no, Tim, there you are.
Thank you, sorry. Sorry, I didn't know that Tim's on that thing. Yeah, so I'm an active travel campaigner. I live in Southwest London. I do an awful lot of work for London Cycling Campaign, and I do an awful lot of work in my local borough, looking at how we make things better for people to get around and better for people to not be choosing to use cars for what I think many of us would deem as ridiculously short journeys, like the friend nearby who drives 250 meters to Richmond Park to walk their dog. But what I'm assuming you're referencing in the chat, what I'm really wondering here is we've got lots of motor manufacturers here, and all I'm really hearing is we need 6 new gigafactories to build batteries. We need to build thousands of new EVs to replace these ICE cars. We need more cars. And then I've got someone in the chat saying, but if we don't build all these EVs, then people in Chinese and African villages won't be able to get around. And what I'm really struggling with here is this idea that this is COP26, right? We're trying to get back to 1.5 degrees of global warming. And all I'm hearing is people saying, let's build more stuff. Let's make more stuff. Let's tell government that what we need is more things on our roads, like charging points. We need more infrastructure. We need more subsidy to make more stuff. And I'm
okay, Tim.
wondering, what manufacturers think about that.
I'm conscious that we're running out of time. Let's hear a response to that from Mike and Frederica. Mike, you go
Yeah,
first.
I don't think it's about building more stuff. I think it's about replacing this stuff that is emitting carbon, emitting other pollutants on the road. And when you're talking now, Rachel mentioned about air quality, absolutely, that is, in terms of air quality, primarily, not entirely, an urban issue that needs to be addressed and needs to be addressed quickly. So the faster you can accelerate this transition, the quicker you can deliver those benefits. I mean, she raised a lot of issues about the urban environment, and as a contributor before said, living in Southwest London, there is a huge amount of public transport choice. London, despite it gets criticised, it's got arguably one of the best public transport systems in the world.
Right.
Look at some of the other cities, even in the UK, and it is nowhere near as good. There is a dependency either on the private car or the bus. As Ralph was saying, we are moving. There is increasing study, investigation, rollout of alternatives to personal ownership through mobility as a service. That does offer certain benefits. Cautionary note, think back for the last 18 months. Governments around the world basically said, work at home, do not get on public transport. And what you saw was people, if you like, reverting to personal transport. It's one of the reasons why used car sales went through the roof, because they didn't want to share that mobility. So it's a fragile shift. And you need to make sure that there is a reassurance to individuals. There is an affordability to that offering, which has to be comparison. There is, and we were talking before about autonomous vehicles and so forth. This is one of the things. There's all these pressures going on at once. It's not just about electrification. It's about a different approach to mobility. It is about safety, and cars are getting safer. Not as they're still responsible for about 1,700 deaths on UK roads a year, which has to be eradicated. But they are getting safer. They are getting less emission. And in terms of how people are considering their journeys, their mobility, again, think back the last 18 months. It is causing people to rethink where they live, where they work, how they work, what is the demand for mobility. And as an industry, you've got to respond to all these different, I hate the word, but they're paradigm shifts, simultaneously, while managing to provide affordable mobility to those that need it. And whatever we think about the car, personal mobility gives you access to employment, access to education, access to healthcare. One of the things that would, one of the real attractions about this shift towards more automated driving is it potentially offers individual mobility to those that don't have it. Again, Rachel mentioned issues about cars being parked on pavements, which is, is indefensible. I speak as someone whose daughter is in a wheelchair, always has, always will, lives in London. One of the reasons she moved to London was because she has that mobility options through public transport.
Thank you. Frederica, there's a lot to respond to.
Again, this is about what messages are we putting out as a company. And as a young progressive company, we are now having two very interesting objectives. One is to scale up our production, grow as a company, to ensure that our products can meet the climate crisis and replace ICE cars. While at the same time having the objective to be a part of a more sustainable mobility, to ensure that our cars can really contribute to a more sustainable way of moving around and not block cities, for example. And this is, of course, where we need to invest in technology. But I also really want to talk about the fact that we need to really use behavioral changes that are just in front of us that we can implement already now. We talk a lot about technology and innovation, like when it comes to circularity, sharing technologies is, of course, really interesting, and the mobility as a service and so on. But we also really need to put out messages from the automotive industry about how cars will work in a more sustainable mobility, and that there are behavioral changes that we need to use now.
Okay, well, on that, can you respond specifically to Tim's point about his worry that at COP we're just talking about building more stuff? And Mike made the point that to an extent, it's about replacing rather than building more stuff.
Mm.
But you refer to technology. David asked about technological changes. Is Polestar prepared to think in terms of making scooters instead of cars for the growing majority who live in cities, for example? Is there a paradigm shift in view there?
I mean, as a company, we love cars.
Okay.
We are a design-driven company who loves sustainability and innovation and cars.
Okay.
And I believe that companies that have this passion to really create as the best product and the most sustainable product will be very needed, and not, these gigantic companies trying to fit all kind of needs that there are. But we did a very interesting thing together with some collaborators. We did remove a last mileage solution for cities, an electric one, of course. So we are trying, and that was a way for us
with
to,
cars or with something else?
No, it's a last mile LM. What do we call it? It's a last mile hybrid solution. Yeah,
is it a little electric
it's a
robot?
trike. Thank you. That's what it is.
Okay.
So just because we know that I mean, we need more solutions out there, and this was just a way for us to show that there's an interesting way of using the electric technology also for this purpose.
Okay, this is one of those sessions that should be a 2-hour one. I do want, David asked about new batteries, and anybody who feels qualified, are we going to see a battery breakthrough that takes us from a 300-mile to a 600-mile battery pack, and thereby obviates much of the discussion about recharging? And I also want to know, in the remaining 2 minutes, how we're going to standardize and rapidly increase the size of the charging network. Ralph.
On the battery technologies, what we in the next, let's say, 5 years, will see steadily increasing density of power in the same size. So basically the range will increase, but the size or weight of the battery will keep the same. So we're moving towards, from today, I don't know, depending on the size of battery, 250 miles to probably 400, 500. So this happens step by step. So the next generation of EVs will have longer ranges at the same cost of the battery, period. Second one, there might be a breakthrough on the, let's say, next technology jump towards solid state batteries, but this is probably the second next generation of cars, somewhere around 2030, after 2030. So this is not at scale in short term. So that's about batteries. And the longer the ranges are, the less charging infrastructure you need. There's obviously a task, since there's so many charging providers and utilities to enter the market. We founded joint ventures for fast charging networks around Europe with other OEMs. So to harmonize at least that it is an easy to use application for the end customer via the respective apps. And there's some, let's say, bundling activities going on in order to facilitate that. I want to have one more sentence on the autonomous driving.
Oh, yeah.
Because this is something, yes, it will come. It will first come probably not in urban solutions, because they are more complex than, let's say, the longer distance ones. I foresee, as also autonomous cars will and have to be electric. So this is basically autonomous and electric. And there might be certain solutions. You mentioned accessibility, for example, for handicapped people in autonomous driving. So that's I think also a sustainability advantage.
And
of
also
these.
increasing the passenger kilometer, the utilization rate of autonomous driving. Really.
So the tricky questions is, but we can answer it as of today, will there be a rebound effect on public transport? If a new efficient solution comes in, let's say, more or less kind of individual autonomous mobility, is it starting to eat up bus mileage, or is it replacing individual car mileage? This is the tricky sustainability discussion on rebound effects, but that takes another hour, unfortunately.
Very briefly, Mike, what are your members telling you about their ideal case scenario about the UK's EV charging network? Who's going to build it? Who's going to pay for it?
Well, at the moment, it's going to get worse before it gets better, because the increase in EV sales is going like that, the increase in infrastructure investments going like that, the gap is getting worse. So the user experience isn't great. And what you're just describing, talk about user experience, the reliability of the system is not good enough. About any one time, about 1 in 10 charge points isn't working. Now in the Netherlands, they're utilized. It's 1 in 100 isn't working. Why is there a difference? The comment was made earlier about the strength and impact of the automotive lobbying, which I find a bit strange. Considering we're facing end of sale, we're facing zero emission mandates, ever tighter emission controls, ever tighter safety, and rightly so, requirements. What we don't have is any requirement on infrastructure. There is no mandated targets. The energy sector, which we're talking about, embedded energy, is basically going to be decarbonised in the UK by, I think, 2050. Will be electric from 2035. That's 15 years potentially of putting brown energy into green cars. What we need is a framework which ensures that the increase in electric vehicles, there's a parallel and commensurate investment requirement, seed funded by government, because you do have a national network, but it needs the private sector to be required to make an equivalent investment. They talk about, well, we're not prepared to do it because it's too risky. We don't know what's going to happen. 2 manufacturers to my left and right have invested at high risk in this technology. They can't be sure exactly that everyone's going to take them up. They've had to take the risk. Infrastructure industry should take a similar risk.
Thanks so much. I'm conscious we need to be somewhat disciplined about time because everyone's starting their day. So by all means, come up and try and ambush us. But I want to give Frederica the last word on this. Stare into your crystal ball, 2030. How big are you? And are you still just a car manufacturer?
Well, one thing I know for certain is that by 2030, we will have delivered a climate neutral car on the market. That's one of our goals. Yeah, we're in this exciting phase where we are exploring technologies, battery technologies. I mean, what will happen there? And also business models. So the only thing I know for certain is that we will deliver this climate neutral car by 2030, and we will be continue to try to be a progressive and guiding star for the automotive industry.
Okay, thank you. The only thing I know for certain is that you are going to be held to that, because I'm really conscious that the chat's gone nuts, that Rachel's intervention was heartily welcomed. You guys are aware of that. We live in the real world, and I think it is surely a good thing that as the auto industry, which sustains so many livelihoods and moves so many of us around, is under intense scrutiny as we go through this transition, and therefore that it's not an opportunity that's missed. But speaking of the real world, thank you also for reminding us that a lot of people do need cars as cities are currently built. I've spent 6 years in LA and have experienced the sort of ritual of being stopped by police in Beverly Hills for not having a car. But I want to thank everybody for what I think has been a great mixture of granular detail. I still want to, I'm fascinated by any incremental increase in battery efficiency and big picture vision. And I want to thank Ralph, Mike, Frederica, and just to mention that we do have another session later today, I think, on precisely, it's a New York Times session, or a Retorted session, on precisely the issue of alternatives to cars. There are alternatives to cars, but thank you finally, Frederica, for your honesty about saying that you love them. I think that's part of the real world. We live in a car culture. It may evolve, but it's with us for the time being. And I hope we've learned a bit today about how to make the next chapter in that story greener. Thanks a lot.